At 1:51 p.m. on the 2nd of June 2015, nothing about Alton Towers suggested that disaster was imminent. The park was operating as normal, rides were dispatching on schedule, and guests filled the pathways, unaware that beneath the routine and familiarity of the day, a chain of unseen failures was already unfolding. On one of the UK's most famous attractions, the Smiler Rollercoaster, a fully loaded train collided at speed with an empty stationary car. In an instant, a ride designed for excitement became the scene of chaos as passengers were left trapped high above the ground in a mangled mess. It would become the worst roller coaster accident in Alton Towers history, leaving several riders with life-changing injuries and families facing unimaginable trauma. That no one was killed was down to nothing more than chance. That summer afternoon exposed a cascade of human error, miscommunication and safety failures that would reach far beyond the park itself, forcing the amusement industry to confront uncomfortable questions about risk, responsibility and trust. This is the story of the Smiler disaster, and of the people whose lives were changed forever. Long before Alton Towers became synonymous with record-breaking roller coasters, it was known for something far quieter. The land on which the park now stands was once part of a vast private estate, shaped by centuries of aristocratic ownership and formal landscaping. For much of its early history, the site was valued not for spectacle, but for its isolation, scale, and carefully maintained grounds. Public access to the estate came gradually, and for decades the experience of Alton Towers centred on walking routes, ornamental gardens, and seasonal attractions rather than high-speed rides. That identity began to change late in the 20th century, as visitor expectations shifted and competition within the leisure industry intensified. Alton Towers adapted by embracing large-scale mechanical attractions, committing itself to engineering-driven experiences that could not be replicated elsewhere in the UK. This shift brought rapid expansion. Roller coasters became the park's defining feature, and each new addition was designed to surpass the last, not just in size or speed, but in technical complexity. By the time the park entered the 2010s, its reputation rested upon its willingness to operate at the edge of what was possible, often building within tight physical constraints that demanded unconventional design choices. It was within this environment of escalation and innovation that the Smiler was conceived. Planned as a statement piece rather than a simple addition, the ride was designed to prioritise intensity, repetition and psychological immersion. Constructed by German manufacturer Gerstlauer and launched in May 2013, the Smiler was built in the X sector area of Alton Towers on the former site of the Black Hole, an ageing indoor coaster that had stood dormant for years. The ride was intended to reinforce the park's reputation as a global leader in innovation and ambition within the theme park industry. They were a company known for compact and complex roller coasters that push intensity within restricted spaces and were tasked with delivering a bold statement attraction, one that prioritised engineering efficiency, high throughput and relentless pacing. Instead of becoming remembered solely as a symbol of progress, the Smiler would become inseparably linked with one of the most serious accidents in British amusement history. Conceived in 2011 and approved the following year, the project moved from design to operation in just over 2 years, a relatively compressed timeline for a ride of its scale and complexity. They designed a world first, a roller coaster featuring 14 inversions, achieved within the tight spatial and planning constraints imposed on the park. The result was a 1,170-metre track, reaching speeds of 85 km an hour, and layered with multiple lift hills, block sections and control systems designed to maximise capacity while maintaining constant train movement. The ride was enveloped in aggressive theming designed to unsettle as much as entertain. Strobing video screens, bursts of artificial fog, and rotating optical discs were layered alongside harsh lighting, distorted voiceovers, and a constant loop of ambient music and mechanical sound effects intended to disorient riders before and during the experience. That sense of controlled unease was reinforced by the ride's physical demands, with over-the-shoulder restraints and a minimum height requirement of 140 centimetres, emphasising the intensity of the experience. This atmosphere was reinforced by the ride's marketing slogan, "You will be marmalised," a phrase used repeatedly throughout the queue line and on surrounding signage, framing the attraction as an exercise in controlled and psychological assault rather than simple thrill-seeking. With an estimated construction cost of around £18 million, the Smiler was intended to be a flagship investment, expected to recoup its cost within several seasons through increased attendance, merchandise sales, and sustained high throughput. That's how many guests can be taken per hour. The marketing campaign surrounding the Smiler was equally ambitious, using teasers, press events, social media, and merchandise to build unprecedented anticipation. By 2015, the ride had become one of the park's most popular attractions, drawing thousands of riders each year, including Vicky Balch and Leah Washington, whose decision to ride on the 2nd of June 2015 would change their lives forever. The Smiler's reputation for intensity was matched early on by its sensitivity to disruption. Before the ride had even opened to the public, a controlled media preview exposed how unforgiving the system could be. A train failed to complete its circuit and came to rest on a vertical lift, leaving invited guests, celebrities and journalists suspended on the track while engineers worked through a lengthy recovery. The incident unfolded in full view of the press and proved significant enough to delay the attraction's launch multiple times, frustrating visitors who had already committed to travel and accommodation. Once regular operation began, the ride continued to demand intervention. Throughout its first year, trains intermittently lost momentum on key sections of the layout, requiring temporary shutdowns and on-track evacuations. One such stoppage led to the discovery of a loose track joint, forcing staff to remove nearly 50 riders while repairs were made. Later, a separate mechanical issue resulted in plastic guide wheels detaching from a moving train, causing minor injuries to several passengers. None of these events caused lasting harm, but together they revealed a ride operating with little tolerance for deviation, a pattern that in hindsight suggested the system's margins were far thinner than they appeared. By the time the park opened on the day of the crash, wind speeds had already climbed well beyond the Smiler's operating limits. Gusts of up to 46 miles per hour were recorded, more than enough to force the shutdown of other rides nearby. Yet despite exceeding its own safety thresholds, the Smiler continued to run. Just after 1 p.m, operators were alerted to a fault by a warning indicator in the control room. The ride was brought to a stop, riders were removed from the station and engineering staff was summoned. As engineers worked to diagnose the fault, a decision was made to add an additional train to the circuit in order to reduce growing queues once the ride reopened. The extra train was introduced while the investigation was ongoing, but crucially this change was not clearly communicated to everyone involved in the recovery process. When engineers later attempted to confirm that the ride was ready to resume operation, an empty test train was dispatched around the track. Partway through its circuit, the train failed to complete the course and stalled on the Cobra Roll element. That stall went unnoticed. With no clear record of how many trains were now on the circuit, staff assumed the test run had completed successfully and that the track ahead was clear. When the ride was restarted, the system detected an occupied section and automatically stopped the next train as designed. However, operating under the belief that all trains had been accounted for, the warning was interpreted as a fault rather than a genuine obstruction. What followed was not a failure of machinery, but a breakdown in communication and situational awareness, one that allowed a stalled train to remain unseen on the track as another was released towards it. The ride was reopened and a fully loaded train carrying 16 passengers was dispatched. Leah Washington and her boyfriend Joe Pugh travelled to Alton Towers looking forward to a day built around excitement, adrenaline and one ride above all others. Like thousands of visitors before them, they made their way to the Smiler, drawn by its reputation as one of the most intense roller coasters in the country. Despite repeated technical delays that slowed the queue to a frustrating crawl, their anticipation never faded. After a long wait, they finally boarded the train, unaware that the ride they had become so eager to experience would become the moment that changed their lives forever. That same day, Vicky Balch had also arrived at Alton Towers to enjoy the park and ride the Smiler with her then boyfriend, Daniel Thorpe. Leah, Joe, Vicky and Daniel were all seated together in the front row of the 16-seater train. The train was dispatched at 4:43 p.m. and was ascending the initial lift section under controlled speed. As it climbed, the ride's block section safety system detected that the next section of the track, the Cobra Roll, was already occupied by the stalled test train. Because the Smiler is designed so that only one train can occupy each block at a time, the system did exactly what it was meant to do. It cut power to the lift drive, bringing the carriage to a controlled stop partway up the climb. The train was not free-rolling or in danger at that point. It was being held in place by the lift mechanism, while the system prevented it from entering an occupied section of the track. Vicky Balch recalled that the pause at the top of the incline felt unusually long, with no view of the track ahead. At first they assumed it was routine. "We just thought it was a normal thing that happens because I'd heard that it does get closed down a few times," she said. But as the minutes passed, her unease grew. "We waited 20 minutes to half an hour and I started to have a really bad feeling. I didn't want to carry on. I was screaming, 'Get me off!' I felt awful." Now, in normal circumstances, the train would have remained stationary until the obstruction was cleared and the system confirmed the track ahead was safe. An engineer investigated the stop, but was only able to account for 4 trains on the circuit. The Smiler was built in a tight enclosed space surrounded by existing structures, terrain and ride supports. To fit the record-breaking 14 inversions within the park's strict height and planning restrictions, key elements of the track, including the Cobra Roll, where the empty test train ultimately stalled, were located out of direct line of sight. Operators and engineers therefore relied heavily on computerized train tracking, sensors and block section indicators rather than visual confirmation. There were no direct CCTV feeds providing full coverage of all track sections, and no single vantage point from which staff could physically confirm the location of every train once the ride was in motion. As the engineer was under the assumption that only 4 were in use and was unable to identify the stalled 5th train, the warning was interpreted as a system error. Under pressure to restore operations, the safety system was manually overridden. The train was released, dropped through the preceding loop and entered the Cobra Roll, colliding at speed with the stationary test train. Witnesses described the sound of the impact as violent and shocking. One witness on the ground, Olivia Marin, said, "The bang was horrendous, absolutely horrific. Everyone just froze for a moment, and then there were screams. People started running towards the area, but no one really understood how bad it was at first." Those screams echoed through the area as park staff rapidly evacuated the surrounding zone and shut the ride down. While the scale of the damage was not immediately clear to those on the ground, passengers had been left suspended high above the park, trapped in the aftermath of a collision that would change their lives forever. Several riders had suffered severe leg injuries, fractures and crush trauma, and as time passed, their condition worsened. Vicky Balch recalled the moment of impact vividly. "I remember it hitting my knees. The pain was immeasurable. Even now I can feel how it felt," she said. She was conscious during the first collision, but as the carriage jolted back and forth, she fainted from the pain, later waking to Daniel Thorpe screaming her name. When she regained consciousness, she saw his injury and others around her and realised what had happened to her legs. "I checked my face and hands and knew the top half of me was okay. But I thought I'd never walk again," she said. "I didn't think I would make it." Daniel remembered screaming Vicky's name when he realised she was unconscious, terrified she would not wake up. As he looked around and saw the extent of the injuries, he knew this was not an accident they would simply walk away from. With nothing he could do but shout for help and try to keep her awake, the moment shifted abruptly from thrill ride to chaos. Leah Washington described the instant she understood the severity of her injuries. "I looked down and I could see my legs were completely mangled. I didn't feel pain straight away. I was calm. I think my body was in shock," she said. "I thought I was going to die." Joe Pugh recalled looking over at Leah and immediately seeing the extent of her injuries, knowing that he had to stay conscious for her. As she asked him if she was going to die, he kept reassuring her that she would be okay, even though there was little he could do beyond talking to her and holding her hand. Something he described as the hardest part. "One minute we were excited to be on the ride," he said, "and the next our lives had completely changed." Although the collision itself was instantaneous, emergency services were not contacted for approximately 20 minutes, as staff initially followed internal accident procedures and attempted to assess the situation before escalating it. And once the call was made, a large multi-agency response was mobilised, including ambulance services, police, more than 30 firefighters, trauma consultants from a nearby hospital, and Alton Towers' own engineers. Reaching the victims proved exceptionally difficult. Passengers were left suspended at an angle high above the ground, all 16 of them injured when the two trains became locked together in an unstable position that made immediate evacuation impossible. Firefighters and paramedics worked at height to stabilise casualties, administer pain relief, and limit blood loss while a temporary scaffold tower was designed and constructed beneath the ride. A small number of less severely injured passengers were evacuated earlier using existing access routes, but those most critically hurt remained trapped until the scaffold was complete. The rescue operation took between 4 and 5 hours to conclude. All 16 victims survived and were taken to hospital, though several were left with life-changing injuries, including traumatic amputations and long-term physical and psychological effects that would alter their lives permanently. Leah suffered catastrophic leg injuries, with her legs crushed in the collision. She sustained cruciate ligament damage to her right knee and later underwent an above-the-knee amputation of her left leg, along with additional injuries including a fractured hand. Leah spent 5 days in intensive care and remained in hospital for a total of 8 weeks. Joe sustained multiple serious injuries, including 2 shattered kneecaps and damage to his hands. Vicky Balch was also seriously injured. The impact caused catastrophic damage to her right leg, injuries so severe that doctors were unable to save it. In the days that followed, she underwent a below-the-knee amputation, a life-altering decision made as a result of the trauma she had sustained. Alongside this, Vicky suffered further injuries typical of a high-impact crash, including fractures and significant soft tissue damage. Her survival marked the beginning of a long and demanding period of medical treatment and rehabilitation, as she faced the reality of injuries that would permanently change her life. Following the crash, the Health and Safety Executive carried out an extensive investigation that ran for close to a year, concluding in 2016. Investigators examined not only staff actions on the day, but also the technical design of the ride's control systems and the procedures governing their use. The Smiler operated using a block section system controlled by programmable logic controllers, designed to prevent trains from entering occupied sections of the track. On the day of the accident, this system functioned correctly. Sensors detected the stalled train and automatically stopped the moving train before the collision point. However, investigators found that the system also allowed for manual overrides, intended for fault recovery under controlled conditions. In this case, warnings indicated an occupied block were overridden based on incorrect assumptions about train numbers and track clearance. The investigation highlighted failures in communication between operators and engineers, poor tracking of train movements following the introduction of an additional train, and inadequate procedures for confirming the location of stalled vehicles. It also identified shortcomings in how fault conditions were displayed and interpreted within the control system, concluding that clearer safeguards or interlocks could have prevented human intervention from defeating a correctly functioning safety response. While no mechanical defect was found to have caused the collision, the HSE determined that the ride's operational design placed too much reliance on human decision-making during abnormal conditions. As a result, Merlin Attractions Operations Limited was charged under the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974 for failing to ensure the safety of non-employees. The company pleaded guilty in 2016 and was fined £5 million, reduced from £7.5 million due to the plea. Individual staff members were not prosecuted, but the findings led to significant technical and procedural changes, including revisions to override permissions, improved train tracking protocols, enhanced fault displays, and comprehensive retraining of ride operators and engineers before the Smiler was permitted to reopen. In the immediate aftermath of the crash, Merlin Attractions Operations, which owns Alton Towers, publicly accepted responsibility for the incident. The park cooperated fully with emergency services and investigators, closed the Smiler indefinitely, and covered the immediate medical and accommodation needs of the injured passengers and their families. Merlin also did not contest liability. The company pleaded guilty to health and safety breaches, a decision that spared victims a prolonged legal battle and allowed compensation claims to be resolved more quickly. Both Vicky Balch and Leah Washington later received multi-million-pound compensation settlements following the crash. The settlements were intended to support their long-term medical care and future needs, rather than to undo the life-changing impact of their injuries. Leah later said that no amount of money could truly compensate for what had happened, but hoped the case would ensure lessons were learned so that nothing like this ever happens again. Vicky similarly stressed that the settlement was about security, not closure, and that holding Merlin Entertainments, the operator of Alton Towers, to account would help improve safety for future visitors. Later, the park's actions were not universally well received. The decision to reopen the Smiler less than a year later drew strong public criticism, particularly from some victims who felt the timing was insensitive. There were also concerns raised about the initial delay in calling emergency services and the pressure placed on staff during the incident, issues highlighted in the Health and Safety Executive's investigation. In summary, Alton Towers and Merlin were financially and legally supportive, accepting fault and compensating victims, but aspects of their operational response and the speed of the ride's reopening remained controversial and continue to shape how the incident is remembered. Since its return to operation, the Smiler has run without further serious incidents and continues to attract large numbers of visitors. It remains a prominent fixture at Alton Towers, operating under revised safety procedures and ongoing oversight, and is expected to remain part of the park's lineup for years to come. However, the ride no longer carries the same identity it once did. In the aftermath of the crash, much of its original psychological theming was quietly scaled back, and promotional straplines such as "You will be marmalised" were removed. The emphasis shifted away from unsettling narrative elements and towards the ride's technical achievement, reflecting a broader sensitivity to how the attraction and its message would be perceived after the events of 2015. But whilst Alton Towers continues to operate and welcome new generations of visitors, the moment time stopped on the Smiler has never truly ended for those who were on board. For them, the legacy of that afternoon is not measured in ride statistics or safety records, but in lives permanently reshaped. Both Leah and Joe have spoken about the difficulty of relearning how to walk, and how the accident forced them to rebuild not only their mobility, but their relationship. A decade after the crash, Joe and Leah have begun to reclaim a sense of normality that once seemed impossible. They have spoken about rebuilding their lives together, not just in recovery but in happiness. Now married, settled into a home they share, and looking forward to the future rather than the moment that once defined them. Rather than marking the anniversary quietly, they chose to turn it outward. Joe and Leah used the milestone to host a fundraising ball in support of charities that played a role in their survival and recovery. With sponsorship covering the event's costs, every pound raised went directly to organisations helping others facing trauma and life-changing injury, including air ambulance services and specialist rehabilitation charities. It was a gesture that reflected how far they had come, transforming a date rooted in tragedy into one centred on gratitude, resilience and giving back. Both Leah and Vicky also went on to become advocates for stronger safety standards within the amusement park industry. Perhaps the clearest legacy of that day isn't found in reports or rulings, but in the perspective Leah carries forward. You've always got to find the positive in the negative, and just got to grab life, because it's so precious, and make the most of it. For some, the ride ended, but the impact never did. Quite obviously, this was a very traumatic incident, and despite the fact that no lives were lost, we've got to recognise the impact that it had on some of the people who were injured. Life-changing injuries. And I take my hat off to the way some of these people have fought to survive and recover. I hope you enjoyed the way the content was presented. I'll see you on the next one, and I wish you goodbye for now.